Welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really complex subject, the Soviet-Afghan War, that decade from 1979 to 89.
Right.
And this wasn't just some regional fight. It started as, well, supposedly a quick intervention, but it grew into this enormous, grinding conflict that really reshaped global politics. Many argue it even sped up the fall of the Soviet Union itself.
That's a crucial point. You really can't understand the end of the Cold War without looking at Afghanistan. It was this bleeding wound. We're talking about a classic asymmetric conflict, right?
Right.
Decentralized resistance fighters against a superpower's conventional army.
And the cost. Staggering.
Unbelievable costs.
Yeah.
Human costs, estimates are anywhere from 1 to 3 million Afghan deaths. Millions became refugees, the largest group in the world at the time. And for the Soviets, it was just a disastrous strategic miscalculation they couldn't sustain.
So our goal today is to dig deeper than the usual narratives. We want to unpack the political mistakes, the internal Afghan dynamics that sort of paved the way for the invasion. And then there's the huge covert aid operation, Operation Cyclone, that fueled the resistance. We need to look at that.
Absolutely. And the legacy it left behind, the instability, it's still echoing today.
Okay, so the invasion itself, it happened right around Christmas 1979, but the tension, the political freeze had been setting in long before that. To really get why it happened, you have to see Afghanistan as more than just a country. It was a piece on the Cold War chessboard.
Yeah, exactly. And it's crucial to realize Afghanistan's always been in this position, right? Think back to the 19th century, the great game between the Russian and British empires. It was right in the middle.
The buffer state.
The buffer state, precisely. And the Soviets kind of inherited that strategic viewpoint.
Right.
By 1979, they'd been the main outside power there for decades. Billions in aid, military, economic, between 55 and 78.
And it wasn't just goodwill. Afghanistan was officially neutral, but economically it was becoming, well, pretty dependent on Moscow.
Definitely. The Soviets had real interests there. Energy, for instance. Natural gas started flowing north in 1968. For Moscow, Afghanistan was vital for securing their southern border.
And then Afghan politics internally sort of pushed things along too. Mohammad Daoud Khan, after his coup in 73, he started pushing this Pashtunistan idea.
Which was incredibly provocative. He was basically laying claim to large parts of Pakistan where Pashtuns lived.
A direct challenge to Pakistan, which was a key U.S. ally.
A huge challenge. And the result, it pushed Kabul even deeper into Moscow's influence. But Pakistan, under Zia-ul-Haq, didn't just sit back. They started covertly backing anti-Daoud groups.
As early as 74.
Yeah, as early as 1974, including Islamist militants. People like Massoud and Hekmatyar were getting support then. So the groundwork for the future Mujahideen resistance was being laid quietly 5 years before the Soviet invasion.
Then things really escalated domestically with the Tsar Revolution in April 78. The Marxists, the PDPA, took power. But this party was deeply divided from the start.
Fundamentally flawed, yeah.
Yeah.
You had the radical Cal faction versus the more moderate Parcham faction. And it wasn't just ideology. It was often ethnic, class-based too.
Okay, break that down a bit. Khalq versus Parcham.
So the Khalqis, led by Taraki and later Hafizullah Amin, they were often rural, mostly Pashtun, very radical. They wanted immediate top-down modernization, no compromises.
Right.
The Parchamists, people like Babrak Karmal, tended to be more urban, educated, ethnically mixed. They favored a slower approach, trying not to completely alienate the powerful religious establishment.
But the Khalqis won out initially, and they launched the Red Terror.
And it was brutal. They tried to force these rapid, modernizing, and very anti-Islamic reforms, land redistribution, changing marriage laws onto a deeply traditional society.
And the backlash.
Immediate and violent. Mass executions started happening. Sources estimate, somewhere between 10,000 and 27,000 killed even before the Soviets intervened. Some estimates go way higher, maybe 50,000 to 100,000 disappeared under Taraki and Amin.
That scale is just horrifying.
It really is. And that level of persecution, combined with the direct attack on religious traditions, it just ignited this massive armed rebellion across the country. The PDPA regime couldn't handle it alone.
Then came the tipping point in September 79. Hafizullah Amin takes power, kills President Taraki. This was the final straw for Moscow.
It seems so. They're already deeply suspicious of Amin. His paranoia, his constant purges were weakening the whole socialist project there. And KGB reports coming back were painting a picture of incompetence, brutality, even suggesting Amin might be making secret contacts with the U.S. Embassy. Now, that was never proven, but The fear was there.
The fear of losing a client state on their border.
Exactly, losing either to an Islamic revolution from within or worse, to American influence.
What's fascinating is that they knew the risks involved in intervening. You mentioned Gromyko's warning from March 79.
Yeah, key figures like Andropov, the KGB chief, and Gromyko, the foreign minister, initially argued against a full military invasion. Gromyko basically said, if we go in, we become the aggressors. We'll end up fighting the entire population. Prophetic words.
But they changed their minds. Why?
It seems to be a combination of things. Fear of losing face, the escalating instability, Amin's actions, and these repeated desperate requests from the Afghan government itself for troops, over 20 requests in 1979 alone.
So the Afghan government was asking for Soviet troops.
Repeatedly. This convinced the top leadership, Andropov, Gromyko, and Defense Minister Ustinov, that the U.S. must be behind the insurgency, and that intervention was the only way to save their socialist neighbor.
Which brings us to Operation Storm 333. Christmas Day, 1979, the 40th Army rolls in, and the regime change itself was incredibly fast and violent.
It was a textbook military coup, executed with brutal efficiency. December 27th, about 700 Soviet troops, Spetsnaz, KGB Alpha, and Zenith units, many wearing Afghan uniforms as cover, hit Kabul.
Their main target.
The Taj Beg Palace, where Amin was. Operation Storm 333 was the assault on the palace. Amin was killed, along with basically everyone else there who witnessed it.
Wow, and then that.
They immediately installed Babrak Karmal, the Parcham leader who'd been sidelined. He went on Radio Kabul, announced Afghanistan had been liberated. They invoked the 1978 Friendship Treaty as justification.
So 80,000 troops, 1,800 tanks crossed the border initially. But liberation wasn't exactly how most Afghans saw it.
Not at all. It was seen as an occupation from day one.
Okay, let's talk about that initial Soviet plan. They thought this would be quick, right? Secure Kabul, major roads, prop up Karmal, train the Afghan army, and get out in, what, a few months?
Yeah, maybe a year at most. That was the thinking.
Like, why did that plan just completely unravel right away?
Well, two main reasons. First, they totally underestimated the strength and speed of the popular resistance. Second, they vastly overestimated the capability and loyalty of the Afghan National Army.
The army they were counting on to do the heavy lifting in the countryside.
Exactly. That army just evaporated. The U.S. Embassy famously cabled that it was dissolving like an ice floe in a tropical sea.
And the desertion rates back that up. From 110,000 troops in 78 down to maybe 25,000 by 1980.
That's right. Just melted away. So suddenly, the Soviet 40th Army wasn't just providing backup, they were forced into the primary combat role, a role they weren't really prepared for, tactically or psychologically.
How so?
Well, their doctrine, their equipment, their training, it was all geared for a massive conventional war on the plains of Europe against NATO. Think big tank formations, heavy artillery barrages.
Not exactly ideal for chasing guerrillas in the Hindu Kush.
Not at all. Totally ill-suited for counterinsurgency in that kind of terrain.
And the resistance, it organized quickly under this banner of the Mujahideen?
Yes, meaning those engaged in jihad. They declared it a holy war against the Soviets and the atheist regime in Kabul. And you saw uprisings happening very early on, showing the depth of the anger. The Herat uprising in March 79, even before the invasion, and then the 3 Hut uprising in Kabul in February 80, where Soviet and Afghan troops fired on civilian protesters.
So the Soviets controlled the cities, the main roads.
Pretty much, the major arteries. But the Mujahideen quickly controlled the vast majority of the countryside, probably close to 80%, operating in small, mobile guerrilla units. The Soviets called them Dushman enemy.
And the international reaction, that must have hit Moscow hard.
Oh, it was hugely damaging, especially in the West and the Muslim world. Invading a, quote, practically defenseless country at Christmas, it caused genuine global outrage.
Right, the U.S. pulled the SALT II treaty ratification, led the boycott of the Moscow Olympics.
A massive boycott. 66 nations joined. Diplomatically, the Soviets found themselves really isolated. The UN General Assembly condemned the invasion 104-18, and crucially, 34 Muslim-majority countries issued a joint condemnation demanding withdrawal. That framed it as an attack on the entire Muslim world, not just Afghanistan.
How did the Soviets try to counter that narrative?
Classic disinformation tactics. The KGB launched what they called active measures, planting fake documents, spreading stories.
Like the story about Amin being a CIA agent.
Exactly. That was a key piece of their propaganda, that they intervened to remove a U.S. puppet. It was completely false, later debunked, but they pushed it hard internationally. It actually backfired. becoming a case of blowback, further damaging their credibility.
So the Mujahideen resistance wasn't like a single army, was it? It sounds much more fragmented.
Very fragmented. It really mirrored the tribal and ethnic structure of Afghanistan itself. There wasn't the central command, especially early on. Resistance was organized around local commanders, often men with strong religious ties.
So religious leaders were key.
Absolutely essential. Sufi networks, mullahs, peers, they provided the leadership and organizational backbone, particularly in the non-Pashtun areas. This decentralized structure, while chaotic, actually made them incredibly hard for the Soviets to pin down and defeat.
And the sheer number of these groups. Estimates of 4,000 bases within a few years.
That's the scale we're talking about.
Yeah.
Thousands of local groups, often around 300 fighters each, effectively controlling their own districts. They didn't have tanks or planes, but they knew the terrain intimately, and they had the support, or at least the acquiescence, of the local population.
And then came the massive external support, turbocharging this internal resistance.
Right. U.S. involvement really ramped up after Zbigniew Brzezinski, Carter's national security advisor, saw this huge opportunity. He famously said this could be the Soviet Union's Vietnam.
That led to Operation Cyclone.
Operation Cyclone, yeah. Under Reagan, the covert aid just exploded. The CIA funneled money and weapons, crucially through Pakistan's intelligence agency, the ISI.
And the amount of money involved is just staggering.
Yeah.
Billions, right?
Estimates vary, but somewhere between $6 billion and $12 billion total from the U.S., Saudi Arabia, China, and others over the course of the war.
And the Saudis were major players.
Huge players. They matched U.S. funding dollar for dollar and official aid, plus raised massive amounts privately through religious charities, reportedly up to $20 million a month at the peak. All this cash and weaponry flowing through Pakistan. It had enormous long-term consequences we're still dealing with.
Because it gave Pakistan's ISI so much power.
Exactly. The ISI became the gatekeeper. They controlled who got the aid, who got the best weapons. They had the beherrschend role, the dominant role, and they used it to build contacts and pursue their own strategic goals.
Which often meant favoring certain Mujahideen groups over others.
Yes, they systematically favored the more hardline Islamist factions, like Gulbudd and Hekmatyar's group, sometimes deliberately undermining more moderate or effective commanders like Ahmad Shah Massoud.
And the weapons themselves came from all over the place.
It was like a global arms bazaar. The U.S. bought captured Soviet weapons from Israel to supply. Egypt sent older Soviet bloc weapons they were replacing. Turkey sold off World War II stockpiles. China provided really useful guerrilla gear. Even the UK sent things like blowpipe missiles. It was all laundered through the ISI pipeline.
This also attracted foreign fighters, the so-called Afghan Arabs.
Yes. Thousands came over the years to join the jihad against the atheist communists, including famously a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden.
How significant were they militarily?
Symbolically, very significant. Numerically, less so. Maybe 20,000 in total over the decade, but probably only around 2,000 fighting at any given time. Far fewer than the hundreds of thousands of Afghans involved. But their presence, their ideology, and sometimes their actions like alleged massacres of surrendering troops definitely added another complex layer to the conflict.
Okay, let's move into the mid-war years, say around 1983. The Soviets realized their initial tactics weren't working. What did they shift to? I imagine hearing those Ma-24 Hind helicopters became terrifying.
Absolutely terrifying. When the quick victory didn't happen, the strategy shifted. It became much more brutal, a real scorched earth approach. The goal wasn't just to defeat the Mujahideen fighters. It was to destroy their support base among the civilian population.
How did they do that?
By systematically destroying villages suspected of harboring resistance, using helicopter gunships, airstrikes, armored assaults to wipe out homes, crops, livestock, basically make areas unlivable to deny the guerrillas food and shelter.
Intimidation and displacement is a tactic.
Exactly. And it worked in a horrible way. It drove millions of people off their land, over 3 million internally displaced, millions more fleeing to Pakistan and Iran. It created that massive refugee crisis we talked about.
And the weapons used, particularly the mines.
That's one of the darkest parts of the war. The Soviets dropped vast quantities of anti-personnel mines, often scattered from the air. Things like the PFM-1, the butterfly mine.
The one sometimes called toy mines.
Yeah, tragically, because they were small, plastic, sometimes brightly colored, and children would pick them up. They weren't really designed to kill, but to maim, to terrorize, to make entire regions unsafe for anyone to walk through. Just pure terror weapons.
On the intelligence front, the Soviets relied a lot on the Afghan secret police, KHAD, didn't they?
They did. KHAD became their eyes and ears on the ground to an extent. They were quite effective at infiltrating some resistance groups, spreading propaganda, and maybe most importantly, bribing tribal militias to switch sides or stay neutral.
Playing on old rivalries.
Precisely. KHAD was good at exploiting those internal divisions within the resistance, but overall, the Soviet counterinsurgency effort was hampered by some fundamental problems.
Like the morale of their own troops.
Morale was a huge issue. Most of the 115,000 Soviet troops there at the peak were young conscripts. They weren't trained for this kind of grinding guerrilla war. They didn't want to be there, and they faced incredibly harsh conditions, including brutal hazing within the Soviet army itself, to Davjana.
And their intelligence gathering wasn't really suited for this war either.
Right. They relied way too much on things like aerial photos and radio intercepts, which aren't always that useful against small, dispersed guerrilla groups who know how to hide. They didn't effectively use their best assets, the Spetsnaz special forces, the reconnaissance units, for gathering human intelligence on the ground. That was a critical failure in a counterinsurgency context.
Meanwhile, the Mujahideen were getting better at hitting back.
They really perfected asymmetric tactics. Small-scale sabotage was key. Blowing up bridges, blocking roads, attacking power lines, anything to disrupt Soviet logistics and demonstrate that the occupiers weren't safe anywhere. Hitting the power grid in Kabul in '82, for example, that was a big psychological blow.
And they operated inside the cities, too.
Oh, yes. Rocket attacks on Soviet bases and government buildings became common, sometimes hundreds of rockets a day near the Pakistani border. And they used small assassination teams, just 3 to 5 men, to target government officials, PDPA members, collaborators, using poisons, car bombs, simple shootings.
But large-scale conventional attacks weren't really their strength.
Not usually. They could occasionally mobilize large tribal forces, Lashkars, sometimes numbering over 10,000, like for the Siege of Khost in '83. But those forces weren't sustainable for long campaigns. Their real strength, their durability, came from that constant, low-level guerrilla warfare, the death by 1,000 cuts.
Let's pivot now to the people caught in the middle, the Afghan civilians. The sheer human cost is just hard to comprehend.
It's almost impossible to grasp the scale. As we said, somewhere between 1 and 3 million Afghans likely died. And within that, maybe 500,000 to 2 million were civilians. Millions more wounded, maimed for life.
And the refugee crisis, 5.5 million people driven out by 1981, the largest refugee population in the world.
Think about the impact on neighboring Pakistan and Iran, absorbing millions of people, and the impact inside Afghanistan.
Yeah.
The war just tore the fabric of society apart. Well, sources talk about the introduction of a culture of guns, drugs, and terrorism. The traditional power structures, village elders, religious scholars, intellectuals, they collapsed or were destroyed, and you had a whole generation growing up knowing nothing but war, displacement, violence. Their future was shaped by conflict from birth.
And the resistance was deeply tied to defending cultural and religious identity, wasn't it? The PDPA regime was seen as anti-Islamic.
Fundamentally. From the perspective of the majority of the population, this Marxist government, backed by atheist Soviets, was attacking the core of their way of life. Those radical reforms on marriage, land, women's rights, they were seen as a direct assault on Islam and tradition.
Which is why it became a jihad.
Exactly. That framing, the holy war, was crucial for mobilization. It elevated religious figures, the mullahs, the pyrs, into key leadership roles, especially outside the main cities. They weren't just spiritual leaders, they became military and political organizers.
And people found ways to document this trauma, like the war rugs.
Yes, those are fascinating, tragic artifacts. Afghan weavers, often women, started incorporating images of the war tanks, helicopters, guns, soldiers into traditional rug designs. A unique, powerful form of testimony from the victims themselves.
Getting accurate news out of Afghanistan was incredibly difficult for journalists, wasn't it?
Extremely difficult and dangerous. It's remote, rugged terrain. And the Soviets actively discouraged or threatened reporters. There's that chilling quote from the Soviet ambassador in '84 basically saying, any journalist caught traveling with the Mujahideen would be killed.
So the world often got conflicting stories.
Very conflicting. You had Western media, particularly in the U.S., highlighting Soviet atrocities, sometimes using terms like genocide. But then other reports noted that while Soviet brutality against civilians was widespread and systematic, Mujahideen violence was generally more contained, usually directed at captured enemy soldiers rather than civilians, though certainly not always. It was hard to get a clear, unbiased picture.
All right, let's move into the later stages of the war. It's 1986. The conflict has been a bloody stalemate for years. But then something arrives that dramatically shifts the balance, especially in the air.
Yes, this is where the Stinger missile enters the story. The Femin 92 Stinger. It's a man-portable, shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missile. Relatively simple to use, highly effective against low-flying aircraft, especially helicopters. It started arriving in significant numbers in September 1986.
And it's often called the game changer. Is that accurate?
Well, that's a popular narrative, certainly in the West. Many analysts at the time, and since, have pointed to the Stinger as decisive. They cite kill ratios as high as 70%, claiming it downed hundreds of Soviet aircraft in the last couple of years of the war. Congressman Charlie Wilson famously boasts to the Mujahideen never again lost a major battle after getting Stingers.
But there's another side to that story.
There is. Russian military analysts, looking back, tend to downplay the Stinger's impact significantly. They point to official Soviet records showing much lower losses. Maybe only 35 fixed-wing aircraft, and 63 helicopters lost to all causes, not just Stingers, in 87-88. They argued the Stinger's effectiveness was wildly exaggerated for Western propaganda purposes.
So the truth is likely somewhere in the middle.
Probably. Even if the kill numbers were inflated, the psychological impact was undeniable.
Yeah.
Soviet pilots suddenly felt much more vulnerable, and the Soviets reacted immediately. They developed countermeasures, flares, infrared jammers, new exhaust systems on helicopters. They changed tactics, flying higher, often at night.
Which would make their attacks less accurate, presumably.
Exactly. So while they reduced their losses, they also reduced the effectiveness of their crucial air support. And for the Mujahideen on the ground, just having the Stinger, knowing they could fight back against the helicopters that had terrorized them for years, that was a massive morale boost. Their confidence soared.
But even before the Stingers arrived in force, the rot inside the Soviet military effort was deep, wasn't it?
Morale among the conscripts was terrible. We have that KGB defector's quote from way back in '82 calling Afghanistan our Vietnam, a war they couldn't win but couldn't leave. The high command knew they were bogged down.
And the economic cost was becoming unbearable.
Crushing. The CIA estimated the Soviets spent something like $18 billion just between 79 and 86. That's not even counting the billions more in direct military aid pumped into the Afghan government, which actually peaked right as they were leaving in 89. For an already struggling Soviet economy, this was a massive, unsustainable drain.
Plus the diplomatic isolation.
Yeah, countries like China were making it clear, normalize relations, get out of Afghanistan first. The pressure, economic and political, was just building and building. It was reaching a breaking point.
While the Stingers were changing things in the air, on the ground, certain resistance leaders really came to define the struggle. Ahmad Shah Massoud is probably the most famous.
Massoud, the Lion of Panjshir. He was a Tajik commander, incredibly charismatic, and a very effective military organizer. By the end of the war, he commanded a well-trained force of maybe 10,000 fighters controlling large parts of the Northeast. He really became the international face of the Afghan resistance.
And the Panjshir Valley itself was strategically vital.
Hugely important.
Yeah.
It cuts north from near Kabul, a key route. The Soviets knew they had to control it, or at least neutralize Massoud. They launched at least 9 major offensives into the Panjshir between 1980 and 1985.
9 offensives, and they failed.
Every single one failed to achieve lasting control. They'd go in, suffer casualties, declare victory, and then pull back, and Massoud's forces would just melt back in. It got to the point where the Soviets actually had to negotiate temporary ceasefires with Massoud just to get their convoys through the valley safely.
That's incredible, a local commander forcing a superpower into ceasefires.
It showed who really controlled the ground. Massoud became this powerful symbol of defiance.
And the resistance started getting even bolder, taking the fight across the border into the Soviet Union itself.
Yes, that was a significant escalation around late 1984, early 1985. Encouraged, it seems, by figures like CIA Director William Casey and Britain's MI6.
Encouraged to raid Soviet territory.
Exactly. Small groups of Mujahideen started crossing the Amu Darya River, hitting targets inside the Uzbek and Tajik Soviet Socialist republics. Sabotage raids, attacks on border posts, even hitting a factory on one occasion in 87, going maybe 16 kilometers deep.
That must have infuriated Moscow.
Absolutely. It was designed to raise the domestic cost of the war for the Kremlin. Soviets responded with furious protests and thinly veiled threats to invade Pakistan if the cross-border attacks didn't stop. It showed the conflict was really starting to spill over.
So by 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev takes power in Moscow, and he brings with him perestroika, glasnost, a whole new way of thinking. How did Afghanistan fit into that?
It didn't fit at all. Gorbachev saw the war for what it was, an economic black hole, a political embarrassment, and a major roadblock to improving relations with the West and China.
So withdrawal became a priority.
A key part of his new thinking. He wanted to reform the Soviet system, ease Cold War tensions, and the war in Afghanistan was just incompatible with all of that. It was draining resources, killing young Soviets, and damaging their image globally. Getting out became essential. This decision paralleled other Soviet moves, like pulling back from Mongolia and pressuring Vietnam over Kampuchea.
And wasn't there dissent within the Soviet military itself about the war even earlier on?
Yes, there was. Figures like Marshal Ogarkov, the chief of the general staff early in the war, had warned against intervention, predicting it would become a protracted guerrilla conflict they couldn't win with the forces deployed. His warnings were ignored by the political leadership at the time, but by the mid-'80s, it was clear he'd been right.
The tactical failures were just undeniable by then.
Completely. That reliance on heavy armor, large formations. It just didn't work against mobile guerrillas in the mountains. It was notably ineffective, as many analyses concluded.
And they never really solved the problem of holding territory, did they?
No. They could launch big offensives, sweep through an area, inflict damage, but then they'd pull the troops out, usually needed elsewhere, so the Mujahideen would just filter back in. It meant there were no lasting gains, and it just alienated the local population further because they knew the Soviets couldn't offer permanent protection.
How did the Afghan regime in Kabul feel about this Soviet decision to leave?
They were terrified. The PDP government, first under Karmal and then under Najibullah, knew they were deeply dependent on Soviet military and economic support. They bitterly resented the withdrawal plan because they doubted correctly, as it turned out, their ability to survive on their own. Even though on paper, the Afghan army, the DRA, was built up to over 300,000 personnel.
But plagued by desertion and low morale.
Exactly. The numbers looked good, but the reality was very different.
While all this was happening internally, diplomatic efforts were underway to broker a withdrawal.
Yes, mainly led by Pakistan, starting around 1983. This eventually led to the UN-sponsored talks in Geneva. The goal became finding a framework for a Soviet exit that wouldn't lead to immediate chaos, involving guarantees of non-interference from both the U.S. and the USSR.
But there was a missed opportunity for a more stable transition involving the former king.
There was. The exiled king Zahir Shah was still quite popular among many Afghans. UN negotiators saw him as a potential figurehead for a broad-based interim government that could unite different factions and prevent a civil war after the Soviets left.
But Pakistan blocked it.
Pakistan's president Zia-ul-Haq effectively vetoed it. He refused to grant the ex-king a visa to participate in talks. Zia was determined to see his own preferred candidate, the hardline Islamist Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, take power in Kabul.
So that decision basically doomed any chance of a peaceful coalition.
Many observers believe so. It ensured that the different Mujahideen factions, armed to the teeth by now, would immediately turn on each other once the common enemy of the Soviets was gone. The stage was set for civil war even before the withdrawal was complete.
So the end is finally in sight. The Geneva Accords are signed in April 1988. There must have been a sense of finality, maybe relief in Moscow?
Relief, certainly, but also anxiety about what would happen next. The Accords laid out the timeline. The withdrawal happened in 2 stages. It culminated in that very famous, very symbolic moment on February 15, 1989.
General Gromov walking across the bridge.
Lieutenant General Boris Gromov, the commander of the 40th Army, the last Soviet soldier officially leaving Afghan territory, walking alone across the Friendship Bridge over the Amudarya River into what was then the Uzbek SSR. A powerful image marking the end of the decade-long occupation.
But the departure wasn't entirely smooth. There was one last major Soviet offensive, Operation Typhoon.
Yes. In January 1989, just weeks before the final withdrawal, Soviet Defense Minister Yazov ordered a massive attack on Massoud's forces in the Panjshir Valley.
Why? Weren't there ceasefires negotiated for the withdrawal?
There were. Local Soviet commanders had made deals with various Mujahideen groups, including Massoud, to ensure their troops could pull out safely. But Yazov ordered Operation Typhoon anyway. It seems the goal was a parting shot, trying to weaken Massoud significantly to give the Najibullah regime in Kabul a better chance of survival after the Soviets left.
So they broke the ceasefire.
Fundamentally breached it. They hit the valley hard, with long-range Scud missiles, heavy bombing, artillery. Hundreds of Mujahideen were killed, and many civilians too.
How did Massoud react?
Interestingly, despite this betrayal, Massoud chose not to retaliate against the withdrawing Soviet columns. He seemed focused on the bigger picture, the post-Soviet struggle for power that was about to begin.
At the time, what was the expectation for Najibullah's government once the Soviets were gone?
The overwhelming consensus, especially among Western diplomats and analysts, was that the Kabul regime would collapse almost immediately. Weeks, maybe months at most.
But that didn't happen.
No, it was one of the big surprises. Najibullah's government proved far more resilient than anyone expected.
How did they manage that?
Well, they still had a relatively well-equipped army and, crucially, the brutal secret police, KHAD. They were receiving massive amounts of Soviet aid right up until the end. And they managed to win some key battles, most importantly the Battle of Jalalabad in 1989, where they repelled a major Mujahideen offensive. They even launched some successful counteroffensives in 1990.
So Najibullah held on for how long?
For 3 more years after the Soviet withdrawal. His government didn't actually fall until April 1992. And the final trigger wasn't military defeat. It was the complete dissolution of the Soviet Union itself in December 1991, which cut off all the aid, the money, the fuel, the spare parts that had kept his regime afloat.
So the Soviets leave, Najibullah eventually falls, but peace doesn't come to Afghanistan.
Not even close. The withdrawal just ushered in the next phase of conflict. The victorious Mujahideen factions, who had united against the Soviets, immediately turned their guns on each other.
The Afghan Civil War.
A truly brutal civil war from 1992 to 1996. The different factions, often ethnically based and backed by regional powers, fought over the ruins of Kabul and the rest of the country. The state completely collapsed. Warlords carved up territory.
And Najibullah himself met a grim end.
A horrific end. After his government fell, he took refuge in a UN compound in Kabul. He stayed there for 4 years, but when the Taliban captured Kabul in 1996, they dragged him out, tortured him publicly, castrated him, and then hanged his body from a lamppost, a symbol of the utter brutality of the time.
And this chaos, this civil war, is what paved the way for the Taliban.
Directly. The Taliban emerged in 1994, promising to end the chaos, corruption, and infighting of the warlords. They gained popular support initially because people were just desperate for order.
And their roots go back to the Soviet War.
Very much so. The movement drew heavily from young men, many of them orphans, who had grown up in the refugee camps in Pakistan during the Soviet occupation, educated in conservative madrasas, funded often by Saudi money. They were products of that displacement and radicalization.
Beyond Afghanistan, what was the global impact? You mentioned the Afghan Arabs.
The victory over the Soviets was a monumental event for Islamist militants worldwide. It seemed to prove that a superpower, an infidel empire, could be defeated through jihad.
Right.
So many of those foreign fighters, like bin Laden, returned to their home countries energized, battle-hardened, and with a global agenda. They saw the Afghan jihad not as an end, but as a beginning. This victory directly fueled the formation of al-Qaeda and the shift towards targeting the remaining superpower, the United States.
And Afghanistan itself was left utterly devastated.
Physically destroyed, infrastructure ruined, millions of mines littering the landscape. Those butterfly mines are still killing and maiming people today. Vast areas deforested, economically crippled too, burdened with billions in debt, mostly to Russia, though that was eventually canceled.
Did the war change the internal power dynamics in Afghanistan?
Significantly. Historically, Pashtuns had dominated Afghan politics. But the war empowered other ethnic groups, well-organized and battle-tested. Tajik, Uzbek, and Hazara resistance groups emerged as major players, challenging that traditional Pashtun dominance. This ethnic fragmentation became a key feature of the civil war and politics ever since.
So let's circle back to the big question. Did this war really break the bear? Was it a key factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Most historians and analysts argue, yes, it was a significant factor. Maybe not the sole cause, but a major contributor. It was a clear political defeat, a military humiliation in many ways. It cost billions they couldn't afford. It killed thousands of their soldiers and damaged morale deeply, both in the army and at home. It led to this dramatic loss of prestige for the USSR, especially in the Third World. All this accelerated the internal erosion of the Soviet system. It made Gorbachev's reforms seem necessary, but it also weakened the state so much that those reforms ultimately couldn't save it.
So the Soviet-Vietnam analogy holds, but with a harsher outcome.
Exactly. The U.S. was deeply wounded by Vietnam, politically and socially, but the country survived, the system endured. The Soviet Union, already facing deep systemic problems, was critically weakened by Afghanistan. It arguably did not survive the consequences of that war. The empire crumbled just 2 years after the troops came home.
So looking back, the Soviet-Afghan War stands as this incredibly stark lesson about, well, imperial ambition, strategic miscalculation, and the devastating human cost of proxy wars. Afghanistan became the place where Soviet military power, its political ideology, its economic strength, all of it seemed to just shatter. And that shattering really did help pave the way for the end of the Cold War.
It did. But the tragedy is so profound because the story doesn't end there. You see this cycle of intervention and unintended consequences. The massive external support funneled through Operation Cyclone, the money, the weapons, it achieved its goal of bleeding the Soviets. But it didn't bring peace to Afghanistan. Instead, that very same aid became the fuel for the horrific civil war that followed and ultimately contributed to the rise of the Taliban and the extremist groups that would have such a devastating impact globally later on.
It's a sobering thought to end on, especially thinking about more recent history in the same region. You achieve a short-term geopolitical victory, forcing a rival power to retreat. But what happens when you leave without a real plan for the future of the people, the society you fundamentally altered? The victory in the Cold War, in this context, inadvertently sowed the seeds for decades of future conflict. A chain of consequences, stretching from that decision to intervene in 1979 right up to the present day.